welcome to a very special EWTN on-location bookmark with James Day, author of Father Benedict, The Spiritual and Intellectual Legacy of Benedict XVI, published by our friends at Sophia Institute Press. And James is joining us from our EWTN studios on the Christ Cathedral campus. So welcome, James. Great to have you with EWTN for two reasons. One, as an author of this book, and also as someone who's working for us out there on the West Coast. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Doug. Great to talk about Benedict with you and to be part of the EWTN family.
Right, you're out there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on out there at EWTN and our West Coast studios? I know Father Spitzer's show you work on, right?
Yes, I'm blessed to be the operations manager and production manager for EWTN West Coast Studios. So we've been here for the past couple years, as you know, and Father Spitzer's Universe is one of our weekly shows that we broadcast live. We also broadcast Spanish productions as well. Most recently, we covered the Fatima 100-year anniversary event out of our control room here. So, you know, it speaks to Bishop Van's vision for a very vibrant Catholic community here in Orange, and I'm blessed to be part of that.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate that. So when do you find the time to write when you're so busy out there working in production? And when did you find the time, and whose idea was it to write this book?
Sure. Well, I started kind of thinking about Benedict XVI as a spiritual guide in my own life. He was really responsible for what I would call my reversion to the faith a few years ago. And I started to think out these ideas that he was presenting as through articles. And it was through articles for Sophia Institute Press's Catholic Exchange and Crisis Magazine, where the foundation for Benedict was really laid as a book idea. So it started off as a series of articles that became a book form eventually as a manuscript. But the time is tight. I need to prioritize better. My wife gets a little frustrated with me that I need to focus more on, I think, more the priorities of life than otherwise I'd be writing and kind of creating all day.
Okay. Let me ask you also, you talk about the impact Benedict had on you. You know, a lot of us talk about the John Paul II generation and his importance. Do you think that in some sense there's also a Benedict generation out there?
I do. It's a quiet but subtle generation that I think we're just starting to see the fruits of, because we're also in a strange period where it was only an 8-year pontificate and he's still alive in retirement, which has now been a few years as well. So we're not quite sure how to deal with this. We've never really seen this before. And Benedict, as you know, is so humble. He's not going to be out there telling people what to think. So it has to be an organic, sort of spirit-driven feeling inside that I think more and more people are starting to experience, certainly around my age group. Not as much as I would hope. That's part of why I wanted to write Father Benedict. But I think we're starting to see that. Eventually, he's just going to be universally acknowledged as one of our great spiritual leaders of our time.
Now, you call him, and the book is about Father Benedict. Now, you talk about his life, but you're also talking about his pontificate. Why did you purposely say Father Benedict?
Something really caught me. He gave an interview after he resigned, and I don't think he meant this literally, but I like the idea, and that was, if he had more energy at the time of his resignation, you know, there was a lot of questions of what are we going to call this Pope who's retired? And he said, I would push to be called Father Benedict. It's this idea that he's a priest, first and foremost, and I think we lose that sense when we're talking about a pope. So it's to remind us that he's a priest first and foremost. He's an obedient servant, and that was the idea. And I really kind of gravitated to that idea as, wow, let's start working with that idea. Joseph Ratzinger as a priest, Father Benedict XVI as a priest to this day. So that's where that came from.
Now, in the very beginning of the book, you start off and you talk about an event where Pope Benedict XVI was struggling to find his way around in the dark. An unfamiliar room slammed his head, causing a bleeding wound. You say that night in Mexico, his head bleeding a month shy of 85 and having steered the bark of Peter for 7 years under a hostile antipathy toward the church, A drained Benedict knew that his last gift to give would possibly be his greatest and most unexpected. Why do you think he thought it was his greatest gift or last gift, and do you think it was?
I think it was knowing when one could not go any farther, and having that wherewithal to say it's now somebody else's turn. And I really think that's the story of Christianity and the story of communicating with God. I think of the ascension, basically Jesus saying, finish what I set out to do to the apostles, or John the Baptist, descending as Christ is ascending, or even Moses unable to see the promised land, but Joshua being able now to take the Israelites in. And I think that's such an example of humility, that Benedict was able to see that it wasn't somebody else saying, you have to step down now. He was the one who could finally accept his own resignation. Right.
One of the things interesting, too, we always heard a lot about, and you talk about Pope Celestine V, who abdicated, and the fact that Benedict, went there. He says, Benedict was not the only successor of St. Peter to pray before the memorial to the medieval Pope, who resigned. Both Paul VI in 66 and Pius XII in 48 visited Celestine's tomb. Paul VI seriously contemplated resignation. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, to Monte Cassino. And yeah, it was this idea that many popes thought of, but none saw, none really had, I wouldn't say the courage, it wasn't what one did. And, you were to fulfill your legacy until the end. But the fact that so many were thinking about it throughout the papacy shows not only maybe the burden, but also that this isn't a regal role that one sees until one's dying breath, but it really is a service to the people, to carry out.
Let me ask you,
God's will.
Right. In writing this book, I wonder, I've always thought myself, at least, is that having seen John Paul II as the Holy Father through his whole life and stay there to the final days, do you think Benedict's experience of being so close to him had an impact on his decision maybe not to go that route?
You're absolutely right, Doug. He was his right-hand man, as you know, for almost pretty much a quarter of a century, and he was, and Joseph Ratzinger, Cardinal Ratzinger, was the main figure throughout the funeral and the interregnum period between pontificates. So he knew through the whole sickness and decline of John Paul II that this was not something he was going to do if he would be chosen as his successor. And a lot of people, when they study the resignation, say, well, look at John Paul II until the very end, when he couldn't even talk there at the window. It's not like that's not what you're supposed to do. That was John Paul II's story. That was his gift to us, and it's not meant to be recreated.
Right.
So in a way, the foresight for Joseph Ratzinger to fulfill his own way of things is really impressive.
Right, and again, it's not to take away from the call that John Paul II had, but Benedict felt that he was being prompted differently by the Holy Spirit, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, now you also talk about here, and you mentioned about the whole idea of the Father Benedict and the priesthood. You say that his spirituality emerges the soul of a true priest exposed. And you say, and I'm assuming this was your own experience, as one journeys with him, the theologian gives way to the spiritual sage. What did you mean when you wrote that?
It meant that, to me, Benedict XVI had incredible insights into faith and culture that I never would have realized otherwise if I was just following secular media's interpretation of his pontificate. Once I spent time with him, and he's given so much of himself in his writings and in his speeches, one begins to see that here's a guy he's a prophet. I mean, he's leading us in a time of, cultural relativism and all these abstract topics that are real, that affect people's souls. And the way they see God and the world. And he was giving me at least a signpost of how to become Catholic again in the 21st century. So that's how I see him as a spiritual sage.
Right. You also point out here, and you alluded to it just there before, in the whole idea of relativism, and you talk about that in this book, obviously, because it was a central theme to what he was concerned about. In fact, a rampant secularism as well. You say, to Benedict, the suspension of objective truth and the abandonment of divine love were the root causes of the problems that were happening not only outside the church, but actually inside the church, right?
Yes, exactly. I think oftentimes when we correlate relativism with Benedict XVI, we think of society and culture, these kind of decrees that this is how it is, deal with it. Actually, when he coined the dictatorship of relativism, that was in St. Peter's, that was in a homily to cardinals who were going to be voting for the next pope. So one has to look at it, I think, as both culture and the church, is what he was talking about with relativism.
Well, we've kind of heard this expression used, but here you have it. He has a line here: man's mortal self, however, suffers from a quote-unquote epidemic of heart. He said after his retirement, which quote-unquote leads to corruption and other dirty things, those that lead men only to think of himself and not of the good. And elsewhere you hear where he talks about the idea of the filth. These are pretty powerful and striking images for a pope to talk about when he is talking about things that aren't only outside the church but inside the church.
Yes, he boldly vocalized what he saw unfolding, and unfortunately, with the scandals that have rocked the church and that have alienated so many people from the faith, here was Joseph Ratzinger kind of going into the eye of the storm, and part of it may have been he was unburdened. He thought he was near the end of his service, and retirement was coming soon. So maybe he was thinking the papacy wasn't going to be in his view anytime soon. And sure enough, here is the same guy decrying all of these things and is now head of the Roman Catholic Church. I think that's actually kind of a spiritual warrior to me, to be able to be so open about the problems rather than coding everything and making everything seem okay.
Right, just paper overing them. Well, you say in one sense, his pontificate has been spun as a narrative of weak leadership forced out by corrupting agendas around him. But you say that Benedict XVI is in the mold of the great popes throughout history and stood as a warrior of faith. You don't see those as contradictions?
No, I don't. The problem is, to believe Benedict as a weak leader is to buy into, I believe, certain agendas that are crafted by media and a kind of secular viewpoint that don't quite understand the papacy as a spiritual force. I mean, yes, there were governance issues, there were bureaucratic issues. I mean, Benedict XVI's 8-year papacy wasn't perfect, but he gave us so much spiritual gifts that I think we need to look at that rather than him as a political figure. That's what I was trying to say about that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because you put that quote in there also about how there's this accusation of kind of weak leadership, but yet he was the Panzer Cardinal. How could he be both? God's Rottweiler, how could he be both?
Yeah. Funny how that works.
Right.
But I think at the same time, it's interesting. Here's the Panzer Cardinal for 24 years, and then he becomes Benedict XVI, and his first encyclical is about love. And no one knew what to think about that. So suddenly, you had to rewrite how Benedict XVI was supposed to be viewed by the media and by a certain secular, culture. So he was constantly throwing people off, and I love that.
It's interesting because we hear from our present Holy Father, and it's funny, in like reading this book, there are echoes of John Paul II and also relationships to the things that our present Holy Father is saying as well. So it just shows the level of continuity. And in fact, you referred to, in a sense, through his lifetime of bridge building, Benedict XVI proposes to be, and I think this is a great image, the Virgil to the Dantes of our generation, calling for both a new evangelization and a new metanoia, a sacramental return to Christ and his church. Now, you've got some powerful images. I wish more people probably read Dante than maybe get the connection you have there, but also use the term metanoia, which a lot of people don't understand what that means.
And they really should, Doug. Once I stumbled upon that, it was like, things were falling together for me spiritually. And I know for a fact, once people discover what that is, metanoia, conversion, people really gravitate to that. I mean, my own brother, for example, just, really fell in love with metanoia when he discovered what that means.
Right. You also, when you get into further in the book and the proper study of mankind, you talk about the whole fact that when Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger dreamed of retiring his post as prefect of the Congregation Doctrine of the Faith. Now, John Paul II refused his resignation several times, right? Because Benedict basically just wanted to go back to Bavaria, right? And probably write and see his brother.
Yeah, exactly. Can you imagine if Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, wasn't doing all of these other things that he did, like bishop and prefect for John Paul II or Pope, and he just could write? Can you imagine what he would have been able to give us? And yet, with all of those things going on, he was still able to give us these incredible gifts. It's just amazing how he's so just brilliant. Bottom line.
You say overcoming the shifting winds of thought so as not to lose sight of God gradually became Joseph Ratzinger's vocation within a vocation. His idea, all-pervading ideologies that are counter Christianity ultimately fall into the dominating force of moral relativism. And he talks about the whole idea that God, as far as he could be known, was man, and that whole image of really an improper understanding of deification, but in a sense, the removal of God so that man can be God. And he says, we get rid of God, there is no measuring rod above us, we ourselves are our only measure. The vineyard then belongs to us, and that's all talking about, in a sense, in his book on Jesus of Nazareth, From Baptism to Jordan, that whole idea of the parable of the tenants, which really is quite powerfully laid out here.
Absolutely. You kind of summed it up all right there. If you think about it, here's a guy who survived Nazi rule, who survived, communism, and then who, once he kind of emerged on the public global scene, was facing cultural dictatorships like relativism. So again and again, he's faced with these battles that people are facing, and he's able to articulate it. And not only that, he's not making it out to be so super dire, but he's giving us an alternative, which is Christ, which is the church. And I really welcome debate about that because, at the end of the day, what has withstood all of these ideologies is the Roman Catholic Church. And one could say it's dogma and rules, and that's how people see it. But I think Benedict and the popes that we've been blessed with are really offering an alternative to living, right, that I think is really, it's really grabbing a lot of people, and I hope it more see Benedict as a signpost for that. Right,
exactly. You go on to say that when you're talking about Benedict in relation to the world we live in and his avoidance of pain, talk about that he said, of course, suffering can and should be reduced by these means, meaning like a certain amount of palliative care. But the will to do away with it completely would mean a ban on love and therewith the abolition of man. And then you go on to say that he said, if we do not accept and respect death, he said this in 1985, we do not accept and respect life either. What do you think he meant, and why did you think that was important to put in your book?
I think he was foreseeing what would happen, 30 some years later, which is the kind of siphoning out of certain members of society who some have decided don't matter anymore. And in this particular case, he's talking about, like elderly people who may seem to society that they're no longer functional. And here's a guy who, through old age, was able to stand and continually push the gospel message of life up to the very end. It suggests otherwise. Suggests you may not see these people as functional, but and here's where the great sort of relativism is destroyed. They're not numbers.
Right.
You want to digitize these people. They have names.
They have names.
God has a
Right.
name.
Right.
God has a face.
Right, that's a great, you have that in the book here, and that's a great image, that whole idea of the culture, in a sense, the Antichrist wants to number people and do away with their names, because it does away with their images, their faces, and that's what we see in totalitarianism as well, and you talk about that in the book. What about the idea that you talk about Vatican II, and you talk about coming out of, in a sense, a relationship with Hans Kung, who is well known to many people, and the fact that some people said there was this shift in his thinking coming out of Vatican II, which he was at. Did you see that, and why do you think that happened?
Yeah, I think we need to clarify for those who say, well, he was just this liberal progressive, and then Vatican II happened, and and then the 1960s happened, and then he got scared and became this conservative, and who we now know as Joseph Ratzinger. Excuse me. But actually, I think he was progressive in the sense that he wanted not so much to see Catholicism in sort of devotion and superstition and that sort of idea of the faith. He wanted us to intellectualize things. He wanted to discuss. He wanted to have us grow in our faith that way. That's, I think, what that means by a progressive idea. And yet, yes, I also think Vatican II didn't quite go the way he was thinking, particularly with the liturgy, and he continued to push for a more prayerful liturgy throughout his pontificate, especially with Summorum Pontificum.
Right, exactly. And a lot of times it wasn't what got said in the documents, it's how these documents were interpreted or misinterpreted coming out of the council that I think concerned him. I know there was just the discussion of that you can't take for granted. I think you have in here the book. Ratzinger realized that one could no longer take for granted the tenets of the faith, that people just understood what those were. And elsewhere you talk about, I thought this was interesting, you talk about when, I think this is one of his first, the Benedict sensed, this is evidence, first papal homily, when he pleaded for the faithful's prayers, pray for me that I may not flee for fear of the wolves. Who were the wolves?
I think he knew what he was going to be up against. I think he knew there were going to be people who weren't going to be happy with him. The thing about Benedict is he was the smartest guy in the room wherever he went. And so when you're the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, when you're guiding people towards the light, when you're basically Virgil, you're going to have enemies. And they came from all over. And I think we saw that as the years mounted and the physically weaker he got, the more he was susceptible to forces maybe taking over without getting too into it. So I think that's what he meant. But I think it also meant the evil one, Doug. I think, Benedict, we don't really talk about, the devil and so much in terms of Joseph Ratzinger, but it's a very real thing to him. And I think he was also worried about his own temptations to give up.
Right. Now you also talk about the fact that, and you have a chapter here that talks about the Marian Way of Beauty, and of course, Joseph Ratzinger's personal encounter with the riches of art emerged primarily through music, specifically the piano, but you connect it to Mary at the same time.
Yes, I do. I don't think we realize Benedict XVI is a Marian Pope, and I think it says something that the last three pontificates, that is John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, all have a Marian shade to their pontificate. It speaks to them as sons of the church, which I think is beautiful.
Right.
And there's been some great prayers that Benedict has written about Mary throughout his time. And I think if you're looking for a deeper spirituality in terms of how Joseph Ratzinger expressed it, look for his musings on Mary, and they're really evoking.
Well, let me just ask you just before we go, how long did it actually take you to put this book together then?
I think a few months.
Okay.
I think I did the first draft.
You planning on writing another one?
The first draft took about 4 months. Maybe. Depends on who's going to give me the contract.
Maybe check with your wife to make sure you've got the time, because
Right.
you have some other duties that are more important. Well, thank you so much, James Day, for finding the time to join us here, talking about your book, Father Benedict, The Spiritual and Intellectual Legacy of Pope Benedict XVI, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com, Sophia Institute Press. Thank you, James Day, for joining us on the special On Location from our West Coast studios. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on Bookmark.